Hi, and welcome back to English Lessons with Stephanie. This is Reading Lesson 7, Part 2 of the story Losing Chris. In this lesson, we'll do a guided reading as usual. That means we'll read this story paragraph by paragraph. You can practice reading out loud by pausing the video and then listening. We will use the GASP method of guessing, answering questions, summarizing, and predicting. Guessing is what we start out with. We guess first so we can learn to read quickly and to try and understand without looking at a dictionary. Next, we have to answer questions to see what we absolutely need to know before we move on to the next paragraph. After that, we summarize the paragraph, which means we think about the main idea, what is the most important information, and then finally, we predict what we will read in the next paragraph. This will help us to better understand what is going on. Before we begin reading, let's quickly recall what we read about in Losing Chris Part 1. So who is Chris? If you can remember, Chris was the narrator's friend. The narrator is the person telling the story. And what happened in Part 1? Well, Part 1 just described how they became friends and how Chris moved away from San Francisco, but they remained friends by talking a lot on the phone and visiting each other. But towards the end, Chris's behavior changed, and he began causing the narrator a lot of stress. What do you think will happen in this reading? Well, what did you decide? What did you think? What do you think we will read about in today's reading? So finally, at the end of Part 1, Chris was behaving strangely, and the narrator began to dread his phone calls. So if you can remember what dread means, it means that she was not excited to get his phone calls and she would feel stressed out whenever he called her. All right, let's begin Part 2. Then, one day a mutual friend got in touch to tell me that Chris needed our help. He'd visited Chris and was horrified to see that he had an obvious drug problem. I was devastated to learn this. Suddenly, the past few years of desperate and sporadic phone calls made sense. I was upset that he'd lied to me, but I put my feelings aside and stuck by him to help him get clean. I researched rehab facilities and scheduled times to check in with him by phone. Sometimes he sounded better, and sometimes I couldn't get a hold of him at the times we'd agreed on. On the surface, it felt like little had changed, but at least I knew the truth, and he insisted that he was trying. All right, this is a long first paragraph. In the first sentence, we see the phrase mutual friend. You know what a friend is, but a mutual friend is a friend that both of you have. So if I know Chris and you also know Chris, that means Chris is our mutual friend. So he's friends with both of us. And here we have got in touch. And I underlined got because we're focusing on past tense verbs in this reading. So got is the past tense of get. It's an irregular verb. And to get in touch with someone just means to contact them, to communicate with them. So why did this mutual friend get in touch? Well, it was to say that Chris needed their help. He had visited Chris and was horrified to see that he had an obvious drug problem. What do you think horrified means? This is an adjective. So this describes how this person's feeling. Do you think it's a good feeling or a bad feeling? Well, he sees that Chris has a drug problem. Drugs are substances that people take to change their moods, and a lot of these substances are very dangerous or illegal. And if you have an obvious drug problem, obvious is one of our vocabulary words from class 5. I hope you remember what obvious means, that you can see something clearly without needing explanation. So if you just look at someone and you can tell they have a drug problem, that means it's a pretty bad problem. They can't hide it. So horrified is a bad feeling, because you get a bad feeling when you see that someone has a drug problem. Then she was devastated to learn this. Devastated is another adjective, and imagine what this adjective could mean. How would you feel if you learned that your very good friend had a drug problem? You would feel really upset. You would feel awful, terrible. But the past few years of desperate and sporadic phone calls made sense. So you can remember that the phone calls had become very weird and kind of bad. So desperate and sporadic could mean something related to that. And the phone calls made sense. And this phrase, made sense, is a very common and important phrase in English. If something makes sense, that means it's logical to you. You can easily understand it. So remember, before, the phone calls were very confusing and unpredictable. But now that she understands that Chris has a drug problem, the phone calls are understandable. That they're so strange makes sense. So she was upset that he had lied, but she put her feelings aside and stuck by him. So put here is in the past tense. All of these verbs are pretty much in the past tense, but put is an irregular past tense verb. Put. So it's the same as in the present tense. We can see that she stuck by him to help him get clean. And you can probably guess what get clean means. If you have a drug problem and you are trying to get better, that means you are trying to get clean. And I'd like you to guess what stuck by him means. So stuck is a past tense verb. It's the past tense of the verb stick, which means to be really, to hold on to something really tightly. So stuck by him, past tense, and she researched rehab facilities. I'm just going to tell you what rehab facilities are. These are centers of places where people go to try to get better from drug problems. Rehab is short for the word rehabilitation. She also scheduled times to check in with him by phone. Schedule means you make a time, you make an appointment. You say, I'm going to call you at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock or whatever time. And sometimes he sounded better, and sometimes she couldn't get a hold of him. So sometimes she couldn't get a hold of him. It means she couldn't reach him. He wouldn't answer his phone. On the surface means according to appearances, how things looked, how they seemed. So she said it felt like little had changed, but at least she knew the truth. Knew is our past tense of know. And he insisted that he was trying. Try and guess what insist means. And let's talk about this last sentence a little bit, that he was trying what? What was he trying to do? What does this sentence mean? If you were going to rewrite this last sentence, what would you write? Okay, before we summarize this paragraph and move on, I want to point out the other verb tense that we see a lot in this reading, which is the past perfect, which is when we have had plus a past participle, like had lied, had agreed, had changed. And if you can remember from our grammar class, we use the past perfect to describe a time in the past before another event in the past. So we use the past perfect to describe the farther in the past than something else. So all these things happened before something else happened. So in this first example, when we use had lied, the sentence that says, I was upset that he had lied to me, we have, I was upset and he had lied. So he had lied happened before she was upset. And the second example, had agreed on and couldn't get a hold of him. So they first had agreed, they agreed on a time, and then next she couldn't get a hold of him. So in these examples, the past perfect shows that something happened first in the far past before something else happened. But that is a more complex grammar point that we will discuss in a different grammar class. Okay, so before we move on to the next paragraph, summarize this first paragraph of part 2. What is the main thing we talk about in this paragraph? And what do you think we'll read about in the second paragraph? Here's paragraph 2. The secrets, however, had taken a toll on our relationship. I no longer fully trusted him. I began to doubt some of his stories. I also felt a little gullible for not realizing what had been happening and for sending him money all those times. For months, 2 friends and I kept in contact about Chris, trying to figure out the best way to help him, and comparing notes. He told me he'd gone to rehab and that he was doing better. I wanted to believe him, but it was hard. I just didn't. We start by talking about the secrets. right? Secrets are things that we don't tell other people. So what secret are we talking about here? What secrets? Well, we're talking about the secret of his drug problem. Chris never told her that he had a drug problem, so that was a secret. And take a toll on a relationship. Do you think take a toll is something good or something bad? Right? What do secrets do to a relationship? Is it something good or something bad? It's something bad. So to take a toll on something means to cause some stress and some problems. And she goes on to say she no longer fully trusted him. That means you believe they're honest. She began to doubt some of his stories. Right, so doubt. What do you think doubt means? How does she feel about his stories? Well, this is related to the sentences that came before. She didn't trust him. So if you doubt someone's stories, that means you don't really trust their stories. Next, she feels gullible for not realizing what had been happening. And try to guess what this means. If your friend had secrets from you and you didn't know what was happening, how would you feel? So maybe you feel a little stupid, a little foolish. And that's what gullible means. Gullible means like, oh, you believe anything. You believe things that are not true. And then she sent him money. Next, she says that for 2 months, 2 friends kept in contact. So kept is an irregular past form of keep. So to keep in contact means you stay in touch. You keep in communication about something. Next, we see our phrasal verb figure out. So these friends were talking and trying to figure out the best way to help him. Right? Remember that figure out means solve a problem. So they're trying to understand how they can help him. And they're comparing notes. So notes here, you think about notes that you take in class. So these notes are not for a class. These are the notes that they have on their friend Chris. So they're probably not writing down notes, but they are just talking about their conversations with him and what they think is working and what they think isn't working. So here again, in the next sentence, we see the word rehab. Remember, rehab is where you go to get better from a drug problem. So he told her he'd gone there and he was doing better. And in the last 2 sentences, she says, I wanted to believe him, but it was hard. I just didn't. So what does this last sentence mean? I just didn't. We have a helping verb here, but there's no main verb. I just didn't what? So what did she not do? And to understand the meaning of this last sentence, you have to look to the sentence before that, where we have the verb believe. She wanted to believe him. So the last sentence, I just didn't, means I just didn't believe him. So I wanted to believe him, but I didn't believe him. So let's answer any questions you still have, summarize this paragraph, and then predict what you think you will read about in the next paragraph. When he asked me again for money to fix his car, I was completely honest with him. I told him I wanted to help him, but I was worried he would use the money to buy drugs. He said he understood my concern and promised not to let me down. He said he would pay me back in a few months. I didn't hear from him again for almost a year. Okay, so in this third paragraph, he asks her for money, and she's worried he'll use the money to buy drugs. He said he understood my concern. Do you remember what concern means? Concern is a class 3 vocabulary word. Concern means worried. So he says, I understand that you're worried, but I promise not to let you down. What do you think that means? I promise not to let you down. This is a very common phrasal verb. That means I'm not going to disappoint you. I'm not going to make you feel bad. He said he would pay me back in a few months. So does she lend him the money? It doesn't say exactly if she lends him the money, but then she doesn't hear from him again for almost a year. And to hear from someone just means to talk to them, to get news from them. So if I don't hear from you for a year, that means you don't call me for a year, you don't email me, and I don't talk to you at all. So this is a short little paragraph, but let's just make sure you don't have any questions. But summarize what happens here, and then let's predict what we'll read about in paragraph 4. The email he sent me was like so many he'd sent before. He was sorry he hadn't been in contact. He loved me. He wanted to talk again. Reading his message, I felt a familiar mix of nostalgia and rage. Not only had he not repaid the money I loaned him, he hadn't even bothered to call me to see how I was doing after I had my baby. If he cared enough to call, he would have known that during that time my mother had died and that I'd almost lost my mind with grief and stress. I had tried my best to be a good friend, but I no longer had it in me. So we see that instead of calling her, he sends her an email. And in the email, he says 3 things. He was sorry he hadn't been in contact. He loved her. He wanted to talk again. And when she reads this message, she feels a familiar mix of nostalgia and rage. So let's look at the word familiar. Familiar means something is known to you. It is related to the word family. So when you see something that you understand, you have a familiar feeling. Mix is a combination of 2 things, 2 or more things put together. So she gives 2 emotions that she's feeling mixed together, nostalgia and rage. So try to guess what kinds of feelings she would have, 2 mixed feelings that are different, if you get this message from someone you haven't talked to in a year after you sent them money and they promised to pay you back, but they didn't. And during this time, all these bad things happened and you never talked to them. So imagine how you would feel if you were reading this message. Not only had he not repaid the money I loaned him, he hadn't even bothered to call me to see how I was doing. We use the phrase not only to put 2 ideas together, where one is to put 2 increasing ideas together. For example, I could say, not only am I tired, but I'm sick too, right? So to show increasing seriousness or an idea that's getting larger. So in this sentence, I start with something smaller. Not only had he not repaid the money I loaned him, but he hadn't even bothered to call me to see how I was doing. So I'm saying that not repaying the money is a smaller thing and then is kind of a bad thing. But what's even worse is not even calling me after I had my baby. Here we see the verb bothered. You might know bother as to annoy someone, right? Like you could say to someone, stop bothering me, you're annoying me. Here the meaning of bother is something similar, but it's used in polite ways to say, to make an effort to do something. So if you didn't bother to do something, that means you didn't even try. You didn't even make an effort. Moving on, we see the phrase lost my mind. Lost is another irregular past tense form. Lost is the past tense of lose. And to lose your mind means you feel kind of crazy. Here we see the word grief next to stress. And you can guess that grief is an emotion similar to stress or related to stress. But it has to do with someone dying. So after someone dies, you feel grief, which is a strong sense of sadness because you have lost someone or something. In the last sentence, she says, I had tried my best to be a good friend, but I no longer had it in me. In this sentence, what is it? I no longer had it in me. So, right, no longer means anymore. You don't have something anymore. So here, it is referring to the first part of the sentence, trying your best to be a good friend. So if you say I no longer had it in me, you're saying I no longer can do this. I can't try to be a good friend anymore. Okay, so answer any questions you had, and then let's summarize this paragraph. Tell us what the main idea is, and then predict what you're going to read about in the next paragraph, which is the last paragraph. For years, I had tried to be his friend, his counselor, and his savior, but in return, he had given me almost nothing. So, as guilty as I felt for giving up on someone struggling with a drug addiction, I cut him out of my life. I couldn't continue to give so much to someone who only thought of me when he needed something. But I don't want to remember Chris that way. I want to remember him as the inspirational guy who could always make me laugh. And I will always miss my friend. So in the start of this paragraph, we have another example of a group of 3 things. I tried to be his friend, his counselor, and his savior. Right? So these are 3 related words. Friend, but a counselor is someone who gives you advice, and a savior is someone who tries to save you, right? So we have these 2 words that have suffixes on them, counselor, savior. Next, we have an old vocabulary word, guilty. So I hope you remember from class 4 that guilty means a bad feeling when you think you've done something wrong. So here, she feels guilty because she's giving up on someone struggling with a drug addiction. Right? So giving up is a phrasal verb. And see if you can guess what that means. And struggling here with a drug addiction. Right? So we can guess that addiction is something similar to problem. If Chris is struggling with a drug addiction, what do you think that would mean? Next, we see the phrasal verb cut out. I cut him out of my life. So let's guess what that means, right? You probably know the verb cut. Here we have the past tense of cut, which is also cut because this is an irregular verb. So she gives up on Chris and cuts him out of her life. What do you think that means? And she goes on to say she couldn't continue to give so much to someone who only thought of her when he needed something. So she's stopping her relationship with him, so cutting him out has to do with that. Then in the final sentences, we have the contrast. But I don't want to remember Chris that way. So in this sentence, that way refers to the sentence before of him being someone who only thought of her when he needed something. She doesn't want to remember Chris as that kind of person. She wants to remember him as the inspirational guy who could make her laugh. And here, I'd like you to guess what you think inspirational could mean. So inspirational has to be something good. That's how she wants to remember him. And in the end, she says she will always miss her friend. All right, so that's the end of part 2 and the end of the story, Losing Chris. I don't know if you can tell from my voice, but I'm a little emotional because, like all my stories, this is a true story about a friend of mine who I no longer have contact with. It's really hard to give up on a friend who you've known for so long, but I thought it was necessary. So, but it's still hard, even though I thought it was the right thing to do. It's still hard. I still feel bad about it. Okay, so to review here, it's a good idea to summarize what you've read and to go back and review any parts you're still confused about. So you should look up words in a dictionary, and if you're keeping track of all your new words in a little notebook, I encourage you to add all those words to your personal dictionary. It's also a great idea for you to continue with this week's writing and speaking lessons. So in today's reading, you guessed at the meaning of a lot of words. And with this class's writing lesson, we'll talk about the vocabulary and what all these words mean and how you can use these words correctly when you're writing and then when you're speaking. So thanks for joining us today. I hope to see you for writing lesson 7.